All right. Welcome to the latest content burst. I like to call a meeting, a ride, a shot, and a letter, and it's how the fight begins in the American Revolution. So before we start, what I want you to think about is this question here: is it ever okay to use violence, and especially against your own government? And if so, when? So the video is going to pause here and answer that question, and we'll come back. So by now, to show disapproval of the British rule of the colonies, the colonists had formed these committees of correspondence to write letters and keep each other informed with what was happening. They created the Sons and the Daughters of Liberty, who led the colonial protest. They clashed with the soldiers during the Boston Massacre. They destroyed the King's property in the Boston Tea Party, and now they're going to meet for the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And this First Continental Congress was held between September 5th to October 26th in 1774. 56 delegates came from 12 of the 13 colonies. Georgia did not participate. And what they did is it was called in response to the Intolerable Acts. When, if you remember, we had the Tea Act, the Boston Tea Party, and the British government said enough is enough. We're going to punish the people of Boston. And until the tea is repaid, they passed these Intolerable Acts to punish them. And the colonial leaders, the delegates, came together and basically they pledged unity. They said, an attack on one would be an attack on all. They met at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. You can still go see some of these same places today. And coming out of this whole idea of the 13 colonies uniting was a real possibility. John Adams said, "This day convinced me that America will support Massachusetts or perish with her." And little did they know that about 6 months after this event, we'd have our first violence. And it's the shot heard around the world. Uh, April 18th, 1775. The citizens of Boston and the surrounding area were on high alert because British troops were on the move. And there was rumors that colonial leaders were stockpiling weapons in the towns of Concord, specifically John Hancock and Sam Adams, that they were sowing the seeds of dissent and making people upset. They were going to lead a rebellion. So the British soldiers were sent on an early morning mission out to find these two leaders and the stockpile weapons at Concord. Well, the Sons of Liberty had a plan in place for this and to warn people. And this is where you hear Paul Revere in his famous Midnight Ride, right? Where you have the one if by land and two if by sea. And we'll talk about Paul Revere and what really happened. But ironically enough, Paul Revere was captured by British patrol, and he was later released, and he was able to get word to the townspeople outside of Lexington and Concord. And you have the rise of these militia. They're called the Minutemen, and they meet on the green of Lexington, which is just outside of Concord, in between Boston and Concord. And on the early morning, these people, these Minutemen, were standing their ground in Lexington when the British soldiers happened upon them. And there was this face-off, this famous face-off at Lexington Green, where you have on one side the British soldiers, on another side the Minutemen, and John Parker, Captain John Parker, the leader, I guess, of the colonial soldiers, said, stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have war, let it begin here. And all of a sudden a shot rang out. We're not quite sure who fired the first shot, but more than likely we know it was a colonist who fired the first shot. The British soldiers were just too well disciplined and well trained for that. At the end, 49 colonists were killed, 73 British soldiers were killed, and the British marched on to Concord, found no weapons, and were pelted and peppered with gunshots and fire and violence all the way back to Boston. And once these shots rang out, there was no way to go back. War would be inevitable. So the colonists got together again, and they created this thing called the Second Continental Congress. This time, all 13 colonies sent delegates. They sent what's called the Olive Branch Petition, asking King George to repeal the Intolerable Acts, offer some peace. When King George refused to hear it and declared the colonies to be in revolt, they set up a Continental Army. And June 7th, they said they quote, resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. And on June 7th, they form a committee of 5 to draft a document declaring the independence of our United States. And eventually, that's what comes out of this Second Continental Congress. So if you notice, take a look at this picture, there's a whole bunch of these colonial leaders, but one of the guys who's not there, right? So you see people like John Adams standing left to right, John Adams from Massachusetts, Roger Sherman from Connecticut. You'll hear about him quite a bit. Robert Livingston from New Jersey, Thomas Jefferson from Virginia, who's the main author of the Declaration of Independence, Ben Franklin. They were on the committee. John Hancock sitting on the chair. But you notice there's no George Washington. because Washington's out leading that army in that fight. So the Declaration of Independence was passed during the very beginnings of the American Revolution, and we're going to see once that this revolution is passed, Declaration is passed, there's no going back.